right, welcome. Today we have Maulik Patel. He's a director at New Columbia Solar, former entrepreneur with a strong passion for renewable energy. How is it going, man?
It's going well, Boyega. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Um, let's kick this thing off and just tell me a little bit about your background and what drove this passion for renewable energy.
Sure. So growing up, my dad's been an environmental engineer. So I've always been exposed to the ecosystem and thinking about sustainability from a young age, even before it was really a buzzword. And I always had this passion about recycling and just understanding how things work. Out of college, I played poker for a couple of years and then decided it might be a good idea to actually get a job and work, 9 to 5, because I didn't think poker would be sustainable long term. So I decided to join Fannie Mae. One of my buddies basically said this would be a good place to work, probably learn a couple new things. So I joined Fannie, worked there for a number of years, 7 in total, until basically called a friend to congratulate him for having a kid. He previously worked at Fannie, and he remembered my passions about sustainability, told me I can get you a job in Houston if you're interested in moving and continuing to work in solar. Took him up on that, moved out to Houston to work for a residential solar financing firm, and the rest is history.
So you kind of stumbled into entrepreneurship by following this passion and having connections into it. What was your initial feeling into joining a startup and kind of being a co-founder?
Well, I've always been interested in entrepreneurship from a young age. In high school, one of my schemes was importing cell phones from England that I could get on a discount relative to the market price and sell them on eBay. So I got my parents and one of my friend's parents to loan my friend and I about $15,000. And we bought, dozens of phones and would just sell them on eBay and turn around and flip the cash and just recycle it and do it over and over again. Eventually, the pricing didn't continue to hold, so that operation ceased to exist. But I've always been interested in how these things work and been interested in it as an entrepreneur, the idea of starting my own business and seeing how things come together. And I realized pretty early on that I was surrounded by pretty talented individuals at Sonova, and it'd be great to work with them to build what we thought the future should look like. So we worked together for about 18 months, my co-founder and I, Denny, and decided there's a huge opportunity to understand how solar assets are performing. And if a team at Sonova is having a hard time building something sustainable, and we can do this more quickly and more agile, imagine how a smaller business that's also in the residential solar space would struggle to build something with data scientists who thought about the problem for a long time. So we decided to dip our toes in the water and see how it went.
It's interesting because I'm always fascinated by people that have a passion in whatever it may be, right? And I think renewable energy is an incredibly important area, and it's awesome to hear kind of your passion for it. I also think that it requires a level of kind of, I don't want to say technical expertise, but some kind of know-how and understanding the science behind it. How did you find community? How did you find people that were also really passionate about this space? How did you find your first employee, your co-founders? How'd you go about doing that?
Yeah, so the community aspects kind of happened by chance, like a lot of things do. I started on the same day as my co-founder, so the cohort was literally myself and my co-founder, and we were just going through onboarding for a new company, and he happened to be a Houston, not native, but he'd adopted Houston, basically going to college there at Rice for 4 years and then working several years after. And he had a network of friends. He was very outgoing, especially as far as engineers go. So he was outgoing. He had a lot of friends. He knew people already at the company. So a genuinely nice person, someone really interesting to talk to. I was very quickly able to join his group of friends and learn about the solar industry, how it works. And the technical understanding just came through actually working and being responsible for asset management. So
Right.
there's many divisions, and I was specifically responsible for identifying performance problems, reporting on them, and remediating them. And then not one person can't program a solution to do it themselves. Generally they have an IT team, and he was the first person I talked to in information technology. And as an engineer, he always asked a lot of questions about how these things operate in the real world. So we would have lengthy conversations just about how it works. Like, where are these data systems? How are we going to connect to them? So we just kind of break down the problem into first principles until we really understood what we were trying to solve and how we could do it efficiently.
I love the thinking like an engineer and understanding what's the specific problem that we're trying to solve, because I feel when you have that entrepreneurial spirit and that entrepreneurial mind, you want to take on the world. But I think breaking down the problem into what specific item or aspect of it can you solve, I think that's really important. What were some of as you guys went through that process, kind of just tell me what it was like, how did you guys discover the specific problem? Did you have, ideas on what it would be? How did you land on what it ultimately was?
So this goes back to our days at Fannie. You kind of know how important it is to actually go into Aptio, solve a problem for a business, be the most useful individual on your team that understands how something works, and then can distill the information that you're getting, because data collected isn't very useful, but data manipulated into actions gives you something to go tackle. So I think the question was, how did you make the data useful and how did you figure it out? Was that roughly right?
Let me rephrase it. I would say, how did you, while going through the process of understanding the specific problem you guys wanted to solve, how did you determine that is where we can be most valuable versus some of the other things where you may have had ideas on improvement, but it may not have been the most useful or the most helpful for you guys to tackle?
All right. So one of the things we learned as I was putting together production reports for the board and for quarterly reporting and monthly reporting was we had specific problems in certain states. And I knew we had a problem, and I would see it continue in a couple months, and then, things would magically get better or a lot worse as the winter would roll around. And I didn't have a real visibility into zip code level information. So I started to say, well, how can I actually get more granular? Where can I find the problems and try to pinpoint something beyond, there's an issue in a state. So as we started peeling back the layers of the onion, you could see there were specific problems in certain zip codes. And so then we would look at the simulations. Basically, we're trying to figure out how solar systems were underperforming our expectations. And we were starting to observe there were certain areas in the Maryland area that underperformed significantly our typical meteorological year, which is essentially set by a couple of different organizations that you can aggregate data and find. And I realized, growing up in the DMV or DC area, there was a lot of snowfall that could, hit just west of DC and be pretty significant. So these patterns were emerging where it started to become apparent we were underestimating the impact of snowfall. And so then, I was talking with one of the PhDs at our company and saying, I think this is what's happening. Can you go back and re-simulate these systems in New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and see if maybe we change some snowfall estimates, if we could get better results? And so just kind of going back and forth on the simulation process, we really understood that's where the problem was. So we took like what was eventually, like a repeatable problem that required some analysis to get to. And then I took it to the engineer and said, all right, this is what we're trying to automate. Can you help me go do this? And so like once I knew what I needed to manipulate constantly, Denny would help me go do that in what would take like me a much longer time. He was turning around in days, and then it was computed in minutes, which was a huge improvement over days and weeks that I would have taken me. And
Yeah.
that's where we realized it was pretty valuable and that
Yeah.
not anyone could do it.
I think that's an interesting and good way to kind of identify kind of where you guys provide the most value. One of the things that is interesting when you hear about startups and startup culture generally, is everyone's doing a little bit of everything. And I think from what I just heard, it sounded like you identified kind of an idea or a theme based on your purview of the organization, did some analysis and brought it over to kind of the more, you know, someone who had more know-how to do it more efficiently and repeatable. Like, is that common within kind of the startup culture? Is that what you found to be the most successful approach within the startup culture?
Yeah, I think that's right. You usually have someone who understands the business and the technical problem, and then you have someone who can actually write the code to go solve the problem or go build a product or a solution that meets the needs of what you're identifying in the market. And in this case, the improvement in performance yields savings for customers. So there's a very clear value benefit to solving the problem. So I was the guy working on the product, and he was the guy working on simulating and engineering a solution that was done in seconds or as quickly as we could.
Yeah. So what would you say, let's kind of go back a little bit. You're working at, kind of the startup. You and some colleagues decided, I think there's an opportunity for us to build something on our own that will solve a unique problem. What was your first action?
First action was incorporating in Delaware, trying to, reduce our liability and figure out if this was a real thing. I would want some other people to sign on the dotted line, put their name on an organization to commit, resources. At that point, it was a little bit of time and some money to move it forward, because people talk about a lot of ideas, but sometimes you actually have to take an action to go start seeing it through. So I just said, who's really for this idea? And then a couple of my friends were. So we got started.
So you incorporated, and you don't have to say specific numbers, but what was your resource pool? Did you guys go find investors? Did you go get a loan? Did you just pull your own money together? How did you guys get started?
Pooled our own money. We were building a software application. So at the end of the day, the real costs were like minimal. It's getting an AWS stack and using what we needed to. So we decided it would be best to self-fund the business as long as possible, because the longer you fund something, the more of it you theoretically own. So that's the approach we took, and we didn't really look back on it.
What do you feel, kind of looking back, what do you think were the pros, cons of being self-funded at the beginning?
I think being self-funded at the beginning made us realize every day that we didn't make a sale or that something wasn't happening was a day that we couldn't pay ourselves. So it just instilled a level of scrappiness that we may not have had if we had raised a couple $100,000 or, like 6 months of salary and burned through it by paying ourselves. And that's the type of approach that I think we've read a lot about and wanted to see if we could make work, because, neither of us had kids. We were just about to get married. We were living in Texas. Living's pretty cheap out there. We weren't too worried about making ends meet on that end. We were both getting married and had savings, so we figured that's a pretty good time to take that approach.
Right. How did you deal with that emotionally? That kind of anxiety of, I've been used to getting a paycheck. Now I've got to, kill what I eat. How was that anxiety or that feeling internally?
It was tough because there were a lot of months that went by without any cash coming in, but we expected that, and I tried to make it pretty clear. There's probably going to be probably 6 months to a year where I would expect no cash coming in, and that's pretty typical. So, if this isn't for you, certainly if it wasn't for me, I wouldn't be doing this. But you got to set expectations pretty clearly for what you're biting off, especially when you're quitting what is pretty well regarded as a good paying job. But
Right.
we were all on the same page about that. So it wasn't easy to manage, but it was easy to set expectations.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll dive just a little bit deeper into that. When you say it was, it was about setting the right expectations, could you expound on, um, like, especially with a partner, what were those conversations like? Where, yes, you guys are both in a same, similar stage in life, not a lot of kind of external demands on, having a certain, income. Hopefully your partner or your spouse is supportive of you living like you're in college again, right?
Yeah.
But um what was the conversation between the two of you guys to figure out when that first dollar comes in, how are we going to split it, right?
Yeah. So, when you set up an LLC, you come up with an LLC agreement, which is like what you plan to do with the cash. And the expectation that we agreed to that I thought was really important was just assuming for the first year to two, we would just reinvest all the cash in the business. Because our fiancés at the time, we both knew were stable. They had good jobs. You know, they were supportive of the idea of us taking on these startups. They weren't like, you can't do this, you shouldn't do this. They understood that there was a passion. They wanted to give us the opportunity to see it through. So the concern was just actually building something sustainable and having the vision to try to build it out, regardless of what the outcome would be.
Right.
So one of the co-founders was a little bit younger than both of us, and he was the one that had the hardest time accepting that. But he was also the youngest, so it was understandable. It's like, look, we don't need to twist your arm to do this. It's a hard decision to make. Something you're not comfortable with, definitely don't do it. And we all came to agree on what we thought was the right choice.
How through the process of their business, how long was Prodigal in business?
I think it was about pretty close to 2 years, all said and done.
Yeah. What would you say were the kind of biggest successes, kind of within that 2 year time frame?
I'd say the biggest success was probably just getting to a prototype stage. So we were pretty quick in a couple pivots and we realized, we should probably pivot. So realizing that we needed to pivot was a success because not everyone realizes they need to make a pivot, or maybe they stay too long on a certain idea they had set out to do. And
Yeah.
then the second one I would say is just being consistent with expectations and trying to improve the product that we were building. And then I'd say, we always try to make improvements, but we didn't always communicate that well to the customer to show them the value add. And I'd say the real improvement opportunity, if we were doing this again, would be to deliver things to customers so they can concretely see what you've taken from their business problem and are able to package into a solution that's useful for them. Because
Yeah.
that really gives you an opportunity to see if you understand the problem and not waste too much time developing a solution that's not useful or not what the customer actually told you. Or maybe through that process, the customer realizes they're not actually focused on the most important aspect of the problem. And that's invaluable.
Yeah. I, th- what it, I think what you said is really powerful because not only not only did you identify kind of, we are not providing a solution that is the best solution for us to tackle, right? So you learned how to pivot, you identified how to pivot quickly, which there is a ton of power in the pivot. But then also kind of your opportunity to or your lesson learned was always staying customer centric, right?
Yeah.
Because communicating the value you're providing to the customer is one thing, but in that dialogue, the customer is going to give you feedback on, I want more of this or I want something else. And that becomes another input into your next product or your next enhancement or your next feature. So that's really powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that goes back to what you and I definitely learned at Fannie, which was related to being agile and having a lot of sprints. Like try to deliver every 2, 3, 4 weeks at a bare minimum. That's, if you're in the software business, an achievable outcome.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about being agile and this concept of MVP, minimal viable product. I would imagine for a lot of entrepreneurs, they have a vision in their head of what their product should be, and they want to realize that vision. Talk to me a little bit about your perspective on achieving that MVP rather than trying to chase down your end all be all vision.
Yeah, so at the time that we were starting to build the MVP, we'd been accustomed to using Tableau, which is pretty sweet data visualization tool, and it's got a lot of capabilities, but we were also in the business of trying to make sales and being scrappy. So what we ended up doing was using, and this is probably a regret that both Denny and I would tell you, was using Google Data Studio. That product was supposed to be like Tableau, but the documentation was terrible. It was really hard to use. But anyways, the core of what I'm trying to say here is we were trying to communicate to customers. It's not, you're going to know what your problems are if you log into a web portal for a solar manufacturing component provider, but you're not going to have those issues prioritized by financial impact. And that's really the value. If you own assets, like, I don't really care that I'm burning $1 or $2 a day. Like, show me the one that's burning me 20, 30, 50, $1,000, whatever that number is, and prioritize it for me based on actual losses. And so it was just putting that into a dashboard, showing you, on a map what that looks like, and then showing that to you in a table. And that is like the clearest sense of value for a person who's responsible for fixing those systems or owns it.
How did you guys define success, kind of through your time in business?
Say the first way we defined success going into it was, were we learning something? Were we challenging ourselves? Because in business, there's no guaranteed successes. And I didn't want to leave, my time at Prodigal, if it were to end, without an actual quantifiable thing I can say I learned that will help me in the future. So that was the first thing that we would define as success, or that I certainly defined as success. And the next thing was getting customers and really engaged people for proof of concepts, because that was the first or second level of things that we could try to understand and see if we were delivering on what our goals were.
What were the biggest things that you felt you learned through the process of being an entrepreneur?
Really understanding how technologies can come together. So there's all kinds of data available to people to use. And through the process of building a platform, I learned about how APIs work. I understand about, there's a whole process of getting data from the field, from all these sensors, translating it storing it into a database, so an extract, transform, load process from the physical files that you're storing, and then understanding all the different relationships in a business context that are useful to create a data mart. And then, that's where you abstract out all the value to a customer. That, I think, is an invaluable skill for data analysis and, for everything that we see, from our Venmo transactions to, a weather service that you're using every morning. Just understanding how those things work and come together to deliver a solution.
So let's kind of move, you've gone from a startup environment, you've gone out, you've started your own business. Now that transition back into kind of a career, having a job that you don't kind of necessarily own. What was that like?
So there were a couple reasons that led to me taking a 9-to-5 job with a company. First was, it was over a year by the time that I realized that this wasn't going the way that I expected it to go. And I had the interest in continuing to see it through. But I thought, well, I'm about to have a daughter in a couple months. It's probably a good idea to have some stability. And it was really important for me to be stable and for my wife to feel comfortable with, the future. And then also I wanted to continue building what I was building. So after we had a disappointing Y Combinator interview, and got rejected from the batch in 2019. Decided to look for some jobs, and I came across a developer in DC that was looking to start owning solar assets. And they basically were really engaged with what I was doing at the time. And it was just a way to continue building out the vision that I previously set out to build, with a salary to go along with it and a team to support me. So it was, like, we'll give you everything you need to succeed here. And it was exciting because I had resources and time set apart, not having to focus on, sales and marketing and all those other aspects that certainly go into a startup.
I think the biggest thing that's kind of glaring in my ears when you say that is self-awareness, right? Even when you look back on how you define success, you define success by learning. Like, what I want to be challenged and I want to learn in this space. You started your career in financial services. So you kind of meandered your way into kind of, this is my passion and I want to continue to learn within that space. And through the experience of entrepreneurship, you got exposed and connected within this community to people doing very interesting things in that space. And you landed in a career job that allowed you to continue executing on your vision with a salary now that you have this growing family. I mean, I think that's a beautiful path, honestly, in terms of, what did entrepreneurship do for me? Could you have ever imagined kind of that journey coming out of University of Maryland?
No. There's just looking back at it, I've never thought about it like that. I never thought like, oh, I'm graduating, I'm gonna go get a job and maybe I'll work for a couple of years and then I'll start a company and it'll be very different from where I started, like 7 years ago. Because Fannie's known to just be very comfortable and it's a great place to work. So that's a great question. Now, I could never expected that, nor could I, based on what I've experienced, forecast the next 10 years out. The world's crazy and life will change in front of us. So it'll be interesting to see what, I do and certainly what you do in those 10 years.
Do you think that you'd be where you are today if you hadn't gone into entrepreneurship and started a company?
I think what I did as an entrepreneur accelerated my career trajectory as a result of what I was able to learn very quickly at a startup. Because from what I've seen in my experience, a startup is you are forced to learn new things constantly, and it's okay if those things don't work, as long as you're learning, going back to that. And I might not have been able to try that at a place like Fannie, because Fannie's pretty rigorous. They spend money. They really want to know what they're getting. And there's not a culture of like, let's rip stuff apart, see if it works. And then if it does work, let's take that and really scale it, which is something they should theoretically be able to do. But, it's different being in a startup.
I want to go back to the Fannie days, because I think that you have a very interesting story to tell about kind of how you leveraged your passion to make changes within Fannie Mae, which is, for the listeners' context, a very large company. I think at the time we were within the Fortune 10 in terms of, because Fortune does theirs based off revenue. So it's a very, very big company, kind of founded during the Great Deal. So like in the 1920s, 1930s. Just kind of share your experience, kind of letting your passion for renewable energy and eco-friendliness kind of shine through such a big corporation.
Sure. Yeah. So I had a decently long commute. It was like an hour or so every day. Some days I try to read something that was somewhat interesting or technical. And one day I came across an article on the colony collapse disorder. So that was about pesticides in the ecosystem and how, our everyday decisions we make with respect to things we eat, the pesticides that are put on the food and the things that we use in our hair and our soap and our shampoo have an externality that makes, the environment deteriorate in terms of ecosystems. So I was starting to understand how systems work, and just really better understanding that there are huge problems and we can take simple actions at as individuals to affect pretty good outcomes. And then a couple months later, I read an article about triclosan, which is a pesticide, which was kind of actually registered after the Vietnam War. So Agent Orange basically was a predecessor to triclosan. So there's a bunch of chemical that was being produced for Agent Orange, and since the war in Vietnam ended, people needed to continue to make soap or things like that. So they said, well, we have this great pesticide. Let's see if we can do something with it. So the manufacturers for soap decided they would incorporate triclosan into the soap. And I realized that this makes people sick through a paper I read authored by Dr. Aiello at the University of Michigan. So I started to ask myself, can we do something at Fannie Mae? Like, what kind of soap do we use? Started like asking really basic questions. Then one day I was using the bathroom and saw, bam, triclosan. So I was like, this isn't good. So then I'm thinking, all right, well, I just read a paper. There's got to be something I could do. So I went to the SVP of Financial Ops and, as it turned out, facilities. I was like, oh, I know Al. I've done a bunch of capital markets ops architecture for him. Let me go have a conversation with him about soap. And as you could imagine, he's like, what are you talking about? And why should I care? Dude's clearing, billions of dollars in transactions every day. Not something he's concerned with. So he was generally pretty inviting, but certainly like trying to figure out where I was coming from. So he basically let me come back to him in a couple months with a more nuanced presentation. So what I did was try to figure out, how can we quantify what is the financial impact to the Fannie Mae employees? And as you mentioned, it's a huge company with over 6,000 employees at the time. So I basically put together a pretty basic model saying, there's on estimate 2 to 7 days that employees are going to be sick because of this pesticide. And I have this paper that says as much. What is the impact in terms of just public health for our company, and something we can absolutely prevent? And it turned out it was a pretty good business case, and it would save over $1 million per year just in terms of people not being sick. And then it solved like the bigger problem that I was trying to solve, which is like having a safe environment for people and drinking water and things of that nature. And eventually they changed the soap like about 6 months later when the contract was up. Al took it upon himself to see that thing through.
I remember it happening, and again, I think we mentioned off air, like thinking back, being older now and thinking back, it's like, that's incredible. It's pretty incredible to, go from reading an article on the train on the way into work to making a business case that spoke to the incentives of the decision maker, but still tackled your own goal, and actually making it happen so early on in your career. Like that's really impressive.
Thanks. It was a lot of fun. It was good to understand a problem and find a solution that's good for everyone. I think, it's just a matter of trying to understand a problem and finding how it affects your stakeholders. And if you can figure out all the parts of the problem and just find common language that speaks to them, you will get to a good decision pretty quickly. There wasn't a whole, death by a bunch of paper cuts or death by committee like you might see generally at Fannie. It was just, this is a well-organized business case, and I involved a lot of different directors and VPs to get the data that I needed on cost of salaries, and also just understanding, what was like the actual public health issues and the percentage of people that had outcomes, and presenting data from the CDC and FDA and Health Canada and similar organizations in Europe, and just being curious. People listen if you're willing to go down that path. So that was fun.
So a little off of the beaten path of entrepreneurship, kind of maybe a little bit of a public service announcement. Like what's on your mind when it comes to renewable energy? Like what are the things that you think about on a day-to-day basis? What actions do you take that you believe other people should take to make their footprint a bit smaller, or have a better impact on our environment?
Yeah. So I think about this a lot. And we got an electric car last year because that was something that was important to me. And clearly electric cars are going to be around us everywhere. And we're going to deploy a ton of renewable energy from solar and wind, which is really exciting. And there's going to be a bunch of batteries. But like the whole reduce, reuse, recycle starts with reduce. And the level of focus on reduce is not there. And that would really solve a lot of problems and save a lot of money. So
Right.
people should focus more on reducing their energy use, having smaller cars, smaller houses, things of that nature, so we can consume less and end up with less in the landfills.
Yeah. This is just my curiosity. What are the things that would surprise people that they do on a day-to-day basis or consume on a day-to-day basis that has a negative impact on the environment?
So like myself, I got an electric car, or like many other people, a lot of people have electric cars, and we think we're doing this great thing, which we are relative to having a gas burning vehicle. But every time we drive, there is plastic from the tires or rubber that's effectively plastic, and it ends up in the environment, and it's gonna, eventually end up in our ecosystem and through time into our food chains, through our supply chains, through that process. So just thinking like, can I walk to the grocery store? Those are the types of decisions we should try and focus more energy on, and like trying to get people in supply chain decision making positions of power to change how much plastic is actually generated. Because when I order from Amazon or other retailers, there's always bubble wrap for
Always
things
bubble wrap.
that you don't need bubble wrap for. Like, it's a book. I don't need bubble wrap. Throw the book. You can throw it in my mailbox. Like, I have a locker here. I'm not too worried about it. So much waste on that front. So I wish, we focus a little bit more on that part.
Nice. So I'm just, I think this has been a great conversation. It's just kind of interesting, and I'm got so many other kind of ideas or questions that pop in my head. What was something that you wish you knew before you started Prodigal?
One thing that I wish I knew, I'd probably say how important it is to have a solution in mind, like on day one, or have like a really clear plan for the first 90 days, and maybe even putting a lot more emphasis on the first 45 days, because that probably would have enabled us to pivot. And then if I used the 90 days or the 45 days as a frame for thinking about each pivot, that would lead to better outcomes earlier.
Yeah.
And people don't really talk too much about that.
Could you tell me a little bit, or paint the picture a little bit more on what does a pivot look like? Like what are you doing? What signs are you looking for? Is it, I've called 100 people and no one bought it, maybe I'm not selling something? Or is it, rationalizing it amongst yourselves? Like, what does that process look like?
That's a good question. I think it's a little bit of both. So when you start a business, you have a couple people, maybe three, maybe more people who are focused on solving a problem. And then you start the business. And then you find out if you're actually solving the problem you set out to solve. Do you have the right people to solve the problem you're trying to solve? And I think it became pretty clear early on that the business we were trying to initially transform, which is residential solar sales, it wasn't yet ready to be disrupted by online sales only. Really needed people on the ground. And we were trying to go into a new market, but the market was pretty tough because the payback period wasn't very short. So it took a lot of no's from potential sales channels to realize this is probably not the thing we should focus on. And then kind of through that process, we realized we don't need this, we don't need all parties involved that initially started the company. So maybe we should go back and think about what the skills that the remaining founders have and how we can use that going forward.
When you guys identified a skill gap, how did you tackle that?
Well, we identified that sales was going to be a challenging part. Like, I was really good at business development, getting people into the front part of that sales funnel. But the hardest part was taking them down the funnel far enough to where they're interested in seeing a demo and then participating in an MVP. And I think the hardest part was understanding the value proposition from the perspective of potential customers and showing them tailored content right off the bat.
What question do you think we should ask the next entrepreneur that's on the show?
That's a great question. I would say the question you should ask is, what are you building and how quickly are you releasing what you're building? Because that is one of the takeaways I have from being an entrepreneur. And also, I think it applies generally to being in the corporate world. And also, it's just a useful skill to have. Think about, like everything you're doing doesn't need to be, you're not doing a PhD, right? You're doing something every couple of weeks and that results in outcomes. And if you think about it from the perspective of who your audience is, you will make better decisions for yourself in any context.
Yeah.
With respect to any goal.
Yeah. That's a very good question. Awesome. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it. Have a good night.
All right.
Thanks, man.
Well, you have a good night.